Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for coming today and for dialing in. I'm really excited. I'm Josh Lovejoy. I'm a designer on the Ethics and Society team in Cognition. Super excited to welcome our speaker today, Kenneth. He's a designer and ethicist. And what I love so much about the stories that Kenneth is going to walk us through today is how practical they are. Because often we think about AI and machine learning and design and product development, there's this big gap between the theory or the science and the application. And so what's crucial is how we can all learn to recognize that we all do have a role to play in this process. It doesn't matter how technical or your perception of your expertise around ethics or around AI, everyone has a role to play, and everyone has the kind of responsibility to ask questions. So anyway, super excited to have Kenneth here, and great, take it away.
Thanks. Hi, folks. Before I start, these are kind of jet lag slides. You know the sort. I've been tweaking them, so they're not super polished, and the talk may be a little sort of rough around the edges. But I think we're going to have time for Q&A afterwards as well, and just have a chat about anything that's not clear, anything you'd like to go through in a bit more detail. So we've all realized that contrition is in. The last 12, 18, 24 months, the industry of ours that's been sort of so renowned for optimism, for seeing technology as an unalloyed good, has started instead to have this creeping recognition that we've taken some wrong turns. The founders and the influencers who previously exalted tech as something that will enrich humanity, well, they're now writing their remorseful Medium posts. They're now forming non-profits to express all their regret for the decisions that the industry has made, and they're begging for a second chance. And there's now an unprecedented and overdue focus on the harms that technology can bring. The press is as likely to call tech a danger as much as it is a savior. And that's understandable because we keep serving up all these fairly easy examples. You're all perfectly familiar with the one at the top there. But Facebook, their emotional contagion study, which manipulated the emotions of 689,000 individuals without consent. Twitter, which I have first-hand experience of, still grappling with and frankly failing to get to grips with long-standing problems of abuse on its platform. And Uber, of course, has been a whole soap opera and almost a poster child at times for unethical behavior. And there is now some evidence that this is having an effect on public attitudes toward technology. Everyone, they're a think tank based in London, and they did a survey that found that 50% of people believe that technology has made their own lives better, but only 12% say that tech has had a very positive effect on society itself. And that to me is a worrying trend, because over the next 10, 15, 20 years, the tech industry at large is going to demand an enormous amount of trust from its users, because we're going to ask people to connect more and more of their lives to the products and the services that we build. They're going to need to trust us with their homes, their vehicles, even the safety of their families. The potential harms of emerging technology are greater than even those present in technology today. The stakes will only get higher. So this has been my focus for the last 2 or 3 years, focusing on the ethics, particularly of emerging technology. And so I'd like to talk about today some of the ethical challenges we have right now as an industry, but also the ones that we're on the brink of encountering or that are really growing before us. But then crucially, I'd like to spend probably most of the time discussing how we can react to that, how we as practitioners and as an industry can help rise to those challenges. I'll start with data because it's one of the more familiar aspects, I suppose. Ethical issues in data are probably better known than they are in other fields. Something very interesting has happened with the way we talk about data in the last few years. Once we used the language of the library, data was catalogued, referenced, queried. It was neatly bundled and stored. But now we've had a subtle metaphorical shift. We now, of course, say that data is the new oil, this thing that's become a cliche. That's actually quite a revealing metaphor. It suggests that data has become something that we burn for profit, and that data is an uncontrollable force of nature. It's a liquid, it's a river, It's a deluge, a torrent. It's no accident, of course, that liquids have a habit of leaking. Just like any valuable commodity, everyone now wants data in some form or another. I think one of the mistakes sometimes we make when we discuss the ethics of data is we limit it to the ethics of advertising. But of course, we know in this room that data has value far beyond targeting and tracking and things like that. We know the value of data for artificial intelligence. Without data, there is no AI. And with sensors in our devices and in our cities and our online behavior monitored and tracked, companies and governments alike now have vast reserves of information on individuals and their aggregated behaviors. Of course, from an ethical point of view, this can pose challenges to privacy and justice. Any imbalance of data is also an imbalance of power. Companies can use customer data to improve service, to innovate, but also to discriminate and to profiteer. Governments can use citizen data to plan resources, to anticipate social change, but also to track, to persecute, and to silence. And we could argue that that distinction between customer and citizen here is essentially meaningless. These concepts are rather interchangeable. Under the right legal and technical conditions, data that's available to companies is also available to governments. Autonomous vehicles, for example, some estimates say they're going to be gathering around 4 terabytes of data a day from their clusters of sensors, LiDAR, and cameras. Of course, that information will be terrifically useful to the companies that operate the vehicles or that program the software, but the police will clearly want access to that kind of data for looking at road traffic accidents. But it's also highly likely that that data will also be sought to try and solve crimes of different purposes, not just car crashes. It's this prospect that led The Economist, who are hardly, as you're aware, hardly opponents of technology and of corporate power, to label the autonomous vehicle as a panopticon on wheels. I think there are 2 common mistakes when we think about data ethics. The first is really how we've approached the very topic within our approaches, within our design processes. We've chosen to hide data flows. Data has been something that's out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's mostly a mistake designers have made. I think I'm hopefully allowed to criticize designers because I am one. Under the mantras of user-centered simplicity, don't make me think, we've chosen to regard data as complexity, something that's best hidden under the hood, something that the user really has no business poking around with and looking at. The second problem, of course, is around security. In the race for ever cheaper connected devices, manufacturers are increasingly omitting fundamental security practices. As one wag put it, the S in IoT stands for security. The Mirai botnet, which you're probably all familiar with, we now know that was caused by 3 kids trying to hamper their rivals' Minecraft servers. And in October 2016, it zombified 900,000 IoT devices, taking advantage of the lax security protocols that have been put in place. So we have this perfect storm where we have a slew of new sensors and tracking technologies, and we have data pouring invisibly by intent or otherwise between a host of devices, and companies and authorities are incentivized to collect what they can. Of course, that makes a breeding ground for potentially unethical behavior. Another now increasingly familiar ethical challenge is the idea of bias in algorithms. Almost all of us, I'm sure, have read the ProPublica expose on the Compass crime prediction system, which found that black people were tagged as future offenders more often than their white counterparts. And bias is a particularly hard thing to tackle because to many people, data and algorithms are seen as clean, objective, neutral things. But of course, that's not so. Professor Jeffrey Bowker coined a now memorable phrase, raw data is an oxymoron. All data and all algorithms carry the implicit bias of the people and cultures that make them. When you choose how to collect data and how to display it, bias leaks through that system. Data is never as pure as we think because we can't separate it from its means of collection and analysis and presentation. Here we see a fantastic infographic from Simon Scar for the South China Morning Post. I think it's great piece of work. It's excellent, it's powerful, and it's clearly laden with meaning. I mean, it metaphorically drips with meaning. On the right here, we see Andy Cotgreave, who now works at Tableau, who completely transforms the message of this same data set with just 3 changes: a new headline, a flip on the vertical axis, and a hue change. The same data with an entirely different connotation. Meanwhile, the algorithmic grip tightens all around us. The smart city is predicated upon the idea of sensing what's happening in our environment and then responding to it. Already we have systems listening for, say, gunshots in our urban environments. We have facial recognition technology that's increasing in power, that can detect ages, ethnicities, emotions. And it's fairly clear that soon we'll be able to build systems that can track people's movements with facial recognition technology, potentially alone, or gait recognition, track people's movements through an entire city. By association, we can then examine who their friends, who are they hanging out with, what are their friendship groups, who are they associating with fairly clear implications. Combining this deep data harvesting with opaque and unquestionable algorithmic decisions, then you have, in Cennydd Bowles' words, the building blocks of authoritarianism. Technologies are also becoming powerful manipulators of behavior. Now, all technology has the power to persuade, but recently that's become an explicit focus of technologists. A lot of it is centered around the idea of nudge theory, particularly in the realm of health. Fitbits, things like that, to help you live a more active life. Diet apps to help you choose healthier eating options. But of course, you can persuade people to do a number of other things. These techniques can corrupt humanity just as much as they can ennoble it. We can create products that persuade or train users to keep coming back. And so we have, of course, this ongoing, it's almost a moral panic, I suppose we could say, around tech addiction. Now, that's not entirely well evidenced at the moment as to whether it's true addiction, but it is clear that chasing engagement in a lot of these software systems has led to some fairly trashy and not highly valuable uses of tech. Again, I'd question here the role of designers in this system. I think we've perhaps failed to interrogate the line between designing for delight and designing for addiction. The techniques that happen to be particularly good for one also work quite well for the other. But perhaps a greater concern is where persuasive technology goes next. If we have a system that's networked, that can learn from the successes and failures of 1 million or 100 million individuals, if it's dynamic so it can change its messaging and its approach on the fly, if it's personalised based on what it knows about you and which buttons it can push within you, that could be an irresistible force of manipulation. It might be a system that's so different that it deserves its own distinct name. This is a system that Karen Young, who's a legal scholar in London, she calls Hypernudge. And there are already crude examples of these systems becoming remarkably powerful. There's a study that found a 50% increase in Facebook ad click-through simply by tailoring messages to interpolated personality traits. So very simple, looking at people's likes and then running them through essentially the big 5 personality tests and then just tailoring image and copy to what people believed about that individual. 50% uplift. Amazon already send billions of automated nudges through their online seller program. Ethically, of course, the big question is, when does a nudge become a shove? When does this actually start to threaten our autonomy and our free will as individuals? And of course, we know this stuff isn't just limited to commerce. The ideas of political persuasion, and maybe even an information cold war that could result from these kinds of things. Again, the ethical concern is that these hypernudges are invisible and therefore beget power imbalances. People can't organise against them, they can't collectivise, they don't know who's doing it, and they often won't even recognise that these techniques are being employed. We also have significant questions, I think, around the sustainability of our industry. Victor Papanek, who's an industrial designer, wrote a now famous book, Design for the Real World. And it starts with, it's a hell of an opening line. He says, there are professions more harmful than industrial design, but only a very few of them. And I tell this to people who work in software design, and they say, well, okay, yeah, it's a cute line, but we're off the hook, surely. We're not the ones wrapping things in plastic, piling them high and selling them cheap. But of course, if you look at, say, the Volkswagen emissions scandal, that was a pure software cheat. Essentially this hack to try to cheat these emission standards, which of course now have created extra emissions that are going to kill, by estimates in, I think, The Guardian, between 20 and a couple of hundred extra people now as a result of these. That was pure software. It was all within the existing capabilities of the hardware that was already there. And of course, we are now entering, or stepping even further into a world of physico-digital hybridity, if you like, where physical products are run by software. I don't think it's a stretch to say that software is heating the world. Crypto mining is a particular threat. I've been tracking this for a little while now as part of my research, and every time I look, there's a new country that's being listed as an equivalent energy use. It started off as being the same amount of energy as Paraguay within the Bitcoin network. Then it was Iceland, then it was Republic of Ireland. I think it's now Austria. I believe we're now at 0.5% of the world's entire electricity demand is being spent on Bitcoin mining alone, let alone the other cryptocurrencies. There may be upsides. There may be positive things we can do that technology can bring to disrupt the supply chain, to move people toward a right to repair or repair at home mentality, to reduce the risk of things having to be shipped and created, centralized and distributed across the globe in this way. So it's not all negative. There may be good steps we can take. But one thing is clear, which is that the technology industry itself promotes some of the fastest and shortest upgrade cycles in consumer goods. The pursuit of the new has consequences. Think of all the handsets and tablets that we've had between us in the last, say, decade. Where are they? What's happened to them? The rare earth minerals harvested and mined to create the screens and the gyroscopes and so on within those. Helen Walters, who's a writer and design critic, reviewed the computer entertainment show, Consumer Entertainment CES of 2011. And there were 20,000 new products unveiled at that event, including some 80 tablets, I think it was. And Walters was scathing. She said, that's not innovation, that's vandalism. And when it comes to ideas like machine autonomy, I think there need to be some profound shifts in the way that we work and also the way that we respond to the ethical challenges that are posed. I think the idea of user-centered design, for instance, starts to flounder a little bit when we're in this sphere because we're no longer talking about use of these systems. We're talking about coexistence with digital systems. How do we live alongside them? The cause célèbre, I suppose, of tech ethics is, for quite a while now has been the trolley problem. You know the drill. Should we kill 2 people to save 3? Would you push a fat man over the bridge to stop the trolley? All that sort of stuff. MIT ran a study called Moral Machine, where they essentially crowdsourced this, and they found, well, I'll discuss the results a little bit later. But for me, it's been a useful entry point, I think, to tech ethics. A lot of lay people sort of say, oh yes, I know all about this. But in the words of Andrew Chatham, who's one of the lead engineers on the Waymo project, really the intellectual intrigue goes out of the problem, but you just slam on the brakes. That's the answer in almost all of these situations. So for me, it masks more interesting moral challenges around machine autonomy. Technologies have a habit of distributing and diluting responsibility. If my autonomous vehicle hits a cyclist, then who's liable? Is it me? Is it the cyclist? Is it the software engineer? Is it the regulator? Is it the car itself? Potentially some kind of mix, some dilution and distribution of responsibility is inherent with these type of technologies. Do we have to take decisions, say, to disable a vehicle if the user refuses to apply a software or a firmware upgrade? Can police, for example, override, i.e. hack, these machines? Now, the moral machine test that I mentioned before, the MIT study, they found essentially a utilitarian approach. We'll come on to some of the ethical theory shortly. But then that was made a bit more complex. There was a study in Science found that autonomous vehicles, if they were programmed to follow that logic, essentially harm as few people as you can, people don't want to buy them. They don't want to buy vehicles that would choose not to put their own safety first. that would choose to risk their own safety above those of, say, a pedestrian. So there's a question there, will people actually want moral machinery if it acts somehow against their interests? What should we not automate? In 2016, the Dallas PD bombed a suspect, ironically using a bomb defusal robot. Now, that wasn't autonomous. They piloted it, so it was like a drone. But of course, these technologies will become more sophisticated. Autonomy will creep into these domains. Many militaries are, of course, interested in lethal autonomous weapon systems. And there are a whole host of other slightly more sci-fi, slightly more sort of stretching and occasionally sexy things that we probably won't bother getting into here. Things like robot behavior, robot rights, legal and moral personhood. You know, if you own a robot that's so sophisticated that it's deemed a person, well, that's slavery, right? We have rules against that kind of thing. Or the future of work. What's the impact going to be on the world of work? How do we find meanings as individuals when essentially a machine can do pretty much anything we can, but better? I'm not going to spend time talking about those because, I mean, that's a whole other section, but I think it's very easy for our field to focus on these far future topics, these distant sci-fi threats, at the expense of more pressing issues. I think what powerful and super intelligent people do with technology is more of a threat than powerful, super intelligent technology. So I think there's clear ethical ground, there's clear fertile ground for us to take ethics seriously within our field, to let new ideas take root. Sometimes there's a resistance to this, that ethics can be seen as a drag. It's going to slow down innovation, it's going to hamper everything that the industry holds dear. But I like the phrasing from Peter Paul Verbeek, who's an ethicist of technology in the Netherlands. He says that ethics should accompany technological progress. It doesn't necessarily need to oppose it. It should just go alongside it. So I like the idea of trying to take ethics and infuse it into our work, to see it as a constraint. Designers know the power of constraints, that they don't always inhibit, they often generate new ideas. We know that constraints are seeds as well as shears. There's a lot of talk these days about the idea of neutrality of technology. And so it requires that we accept that technology isn't neutral, and frankly, it never was. This idea that technologies are just mere instruments, tools, built to fulfill tasks, well, that doesn't really hold anymore. It was a common idea, but it's also kind of a dangerous one. In ethics, you sometimes hear that an is does not make an ought. Just because something is common doesn't mean that it's correct. In 1980, Langdon Winner, philosopher, I think around these parts somewhere, wrote a now famous article, Do Artifacts Have Politics? His conclusion was, well, damn right they do. He gave the example of Robert Moses, he's a city planner of New York in the 20s and 30s, I believe. And the account is slightly disputed, but it is clear that Moses was a racist. And the allegation is that he built bridges over freeways, or the parkways to Long Island beaches, intentionally low to prevent minorities who mostly travel by bus from being able to get to them, because the buses simply couldn't pass under the bridges. So even these bridges, inert, hulking, great, big, hundreds of ton structures, had moral and social and political impact. So we can't separate tech and human capabilities anymore. These things act together, they're interwoven. Things fundamentally change what people can do and how they do it. So we have to overcome this belief in neutrality, this idea that we can wash our hands of the social and political and ethical responsibilities of our work. I'd go further. I'd say that design is applied ethics. Alan Chochinov is a professor at SVA, I think. He says that design is doing philosophy with the hands. I really like that. Now, sometimes that relationship is explicit. If you're a designer of razor wire, then you're making a clear statement that someone's right to personal property is so important that we should injure someone for choosing to contravene that right. But even then, if we're not making weaponry or anything as enormously ethically and politically laden as razor wire, we're still making a statement about the future. Every act of design makes a claim about what the future should be like. We choose one preferred future, we discard tens of thousands of alternative futures. So of course there's a clear ethical component within that. We're making a case for how we should all live. I think we have to be skeptical, however, of people who claim to have easy answers to these problems. I think our field tends to like fairly simple medication. Oh, just don't work for a particular company, or just ban ad-funded tech, or just sign up to a new Hippocratic oath for technology and design. Now, I'm particularly critical of all of those ideas, but actually particularly codes of ethics are a bit of a bugbear of mine. I think if another one was the answer, why didn't the previous 20 work? There's a risk that they become unenforceable and static and lead to this kind of checklist approach that I think sometimes we see with, say, accessibility. I also think that new people may be needed to address these problems. There's a fallacy or a temptation, I suppose, to believe that the people who led us into this mess are also the people to lead us out of that mess. And I'm not sure that's actually true. We won't redeem ourselves if we end up reimposing the same old power structures. It's likely instead that ethical answers are going to come from diverse and underheard perspectives. The great news is, of course, that we aren't the first people on these shores. There's this sometimes arrogant assumption in tech that, we're the first people pioneering this new future. But of course, there are millennia of ethical theory and thought behind us. And it's not just dusty Greeks. It's contemporary academia, it's critical design, it's philosophy of technology, it's science and technology studies. This is fascinating deep work that's happening all across the world, but a lot of these academics sadly aren't taken seriously. I think our field is very intelligent, but it's quite anti-intellectual. I think that really needs to change, because there's so much we can learn from these academics and artists and thinkers to help put our work into context. So I'd like to just draw on a couple of key ethical theories and translate them into 5 ethical tests that I've tried to instill in people and mentees and so on that I've worked with, based in essentially modern ethical theory. One very simple test is, what if everyone did what I'm about to do? What would a world in which my action was commonplace, if it was a universal law of behavior, would that be a better place or a worse place? This comes originally from Immanuel Kant. It's what's known as a deontological approach to ethics. And this is one that's grounded in duty and in a belief in following certain rules and obligation, if you like, on behavior. An example for this might be dark patterns. We're all familiar, I'm sure, with dark patterns, deliberately misleading interfaces. Well, if we all shipped dark patterns, then of course the sphere of technology is diminished and probably our technological lives are a bit worse. So that suggests if we apply this test, we probably shouldn't ship that dark pattern. Another one that also comes from Kant. Am I treating people as ends or means? I particularly like this one. It takes a little bit of unpacking. The question really becomes, am I treating users as means for me to achieve my own goals, or am I treating them as free individuals with their own goals that are probably superior to mine? Now, I don't think this is a question designers necessarily struggle with, but I do think data-driven companies tend to struggle with this in aggregate. And I've seen from the inside how some companies, essentially their framing of users starts to shift with time. They become not the reason for existing, but experimental subjects, means for us to hit our OKRs. Essentially, people become masses. And when that happens, I think unethical design is the natural result. Another view, this is essentially the utilitarian question. Am I maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people? And by extension, am I minimizing suffering? As I say, this is the utilitarian approach to ethics. It's sometimes known as a consequentialist approach as well, because it's all about the consequences, the impact, the outcome. So we're not focusing here on rules and duty, but something a bit more tangible. And I think technologists generally look at this theory and say, there's something in this, right? Because it feels a bit measurable. It feels like something that we can calculate and come to a fairly definitive opinion on. Of course, the downside is, do you really have to do this for every decision that you take in the world? Because that sounds like you essentially become a number cruncher rather than an ethicist. The fourth question that I tend to pose is based in essentially the third main theory after deontology and utilitarianism, in virtue ethics, as it's called. Would I be happy for what I'm about to do to be a front page story, front page of the paper or the websites or whatever it is? And virtue ethicists aren't really interested in the rules of behavior or the outcomes, the consequences. They care about moral character instead. What does it say about me as an individual? Would I choose to be accountable for the decisions I'm taking? Would I sign my name to them? And I think that's important because it speaks to our identity. It speaks to who we want to be as individuals. The final test I'll offer is, it comes from John Rawls, who wrote A Theory of Justice. This is the idea of the veil of ignorance. This is essentially Rawls's conjecture that we should design as if we don't know our place in the system, that a fair world or a fair system is one designed behind a veil of ignorance before we've even dealt the cards of who ends up where. So if, for instance, I'm designing a system of public welfare, I should design it so that it seems fair whether I end up as a taxpayer, as a welfare recipient, as an administrator of the scheme, and so on. So frameworks are useful, and I think I'll refer to those tests a little bit later on. But as I say, ethics is, for me, about something it should be applied. It needs to be translated into action. So I've been thinking about how do we look at the way we develop products, design and build products. What are the points of intervention that we can take advantage of within that process? I'm a little bit wary of this framing because it sounds like ethics is something that sits outside, right? And we have to sort of inject ethics into the process. It shouldn't be that way, of course, but I'm trying to just look at it from that point of view, just to see where we can tease out those moments. The first one is right at the start of a project, I think. We have to start defining our projects properly. One of the most important ways to do that is to think deeply about stakeholders. There are, of course, two categories of stakeholder. The most obvious one is people who can affect the project. But the second category is people whom the project can affect. And we often overlook those people. And so this creates a number of externalities, essentially the economist's way of saying someone else's problem, right? Effects that fall on people who haven't necessarily signed up to be part of that system. Passive smoking is the one that's usually given as an externality. You know, people next to you, no one was designing for that problem. They weren't considered as part of the cigarette manufacture and licensing process, and they yet still have to pay the price. Airbnb, I think, is a classic example of an externality, a company ridden by externalities. Airbnb is fantastic if you have spare property you want to let out, or if you're traveling to a city and you want to hire a room. Brilliant. They've designed it absolutely for those two large user bases. The externalities, the costs all fall on the community, though. The neighbours, the local shopkeepers, and so on. Suddenly there is no community anymore. You have a different neighbour every day. Tax is often not paid on those rentals and so on. Thomas Wendt, who's a designer in New York, talks about user-centered design being quite individualistic here to its detriment. It actually makes us too narrow. We focus too much on just trying to make things efficient and effective for the specific user in mind, like the smiling persona or the user, however we define them. And we've overlooked broader societies and ecologies and environments. So in widening the net, ways we can do that is, we can have a prompt list. Have we checked, oh yes, it might have an impact on, I don't know, children or unions or whatever it might be. But I think we can even add abstract concepts to our stakeholder lists. Facebook are well aware, for instance, that some of their tools have not necessarily threatened, but started to tease away at the fabric of democracy or free press, things like that. Personas non grata is a fairly straightforward idea. It's just my name for essentially an anti-persona. It's a persona that's a bad actor within your system. So, a troll or a hacker or a terrorist or something like that, and actually giving them the space in the conversation, creating a persona, putting it up. And of course, your job then is to hamper that individual, is to stifle their intended goals within the system. Another option here is bias bracketing. This is something that's actually fairly new to me, but is apparently quite common in academia, particularly in social sciences. Essentially, academics, before they conduct a large piece of research, will anticipate up front all of the ways that bias might creep in to their observations and their conclusions, listing them out and then noticing or writing down every time during that conducting the research and evaluating it, noting every time that they think bias may be showing its hand. And then, of course, you end up using those reference points when you're evaluating, checking has bias or could bias be screwing things up as we go. Moving on a little bit in the process, a really important idea for me in ethics is the idea of moral imagination, is using our moral intellects, I suppose, to think about different potential futures and assessing, well, what could the impact of those be? But that's kind of an abstract idea. It's easier if you have a tangible artifact, you have something to look at as a spark, if you like, for creative discussion. And here we can borrow from speculative and critical design and create what I call a provocatype. Some people call it a prototype, some people call it a design fiction. But it's best if I just give an example. This is by Marcel Schoenaar and Harm van Beek. And it's created for 2 Dutch energy clients of theirs. And it's a prototype or a provocatype of a public electric vehicle charging point in a scarce energy future. So essentially, they have to model, how do you handle charging infrastructure when demand exceeds supply? How do you allocate those resources? So the idea is, this is, a large physical thing. You come along and you plug in your socket. I mean, they actually give the cables, right? You plug them into the sockets there. Above that, we have RFID readers. So you tap an RFID card to authenticate, and then dials above to request the energy you want. So you can say, well, I want more, but for a shorter time. Obviously, there are trade-offs. And the system does the rest. The algorithm prioritizes. And so above, that's essentially the energy flow, starting at the present time at the bottom, and then further away at the top. And you can see whose turn it is next, how much energy they're getting. You can see at certain times the energy availability is compressed, and at certain times it's wider. So for me, this exposes what an algorithmically driven world, you could call it maybe an algocracy, might look like in a decade. But the really interesting bit is they also prototyped the RFID cards. And this is part, as I say, of the provocatype. So people are issued with these cards that allocate different social status and therefore different energy status. A doctor, you'll see the one in the middle, top priority, but it comes with a caveat. Unauthorized use is punishable by law. Underneath that, the probation ID. So this is energy that's capped, your lowest priority. It's fairly obvious how social status and potential inequality are encoded and reinforced through these technologies in future. Now, the designers aren't proposing this as the best way to design. They're not saying this is the solution that the city should implement. But it's the design that gets the right conversations happening, that sparks that moral imagination and helps us understand, well, what does this future look like? So it's this kind of weird artifact that creates a wormhole between design and research. You sort of pass between the two. What's really important for me is you have to allow the time and space for that divergence to happen, for those conversations to happen, for prototypes that aren't necessarily good product per se, but get us closer to good product by asking the right questions at the right time, because the debate really is the thing. In the design phase itself, I'm particularly interested in how we can alleviate some of the dangers of invisibility. I think a lot of tech's ethical dangers have come from hiding things that actually shouldn't have been hidden. And so by shifting things like data flows and persuasion into the visible spectrum, I think people can start to make more informed choices. And this doesn't necessarily mean a whole heap of extra complexity. We're talking here about making things available rather than mandatory. An example I would give here, probably my favorite example of materializing a fairly abstract idea, comes from, this is the Prius from 2003, I believe. It's quite an old display. The idea of energy flows within cars. If you own this vehicle and see this energy monitor display, then it gives you insight into a pretty complex flow of an invisible entity, energy, within the vehicle. And of course, then you can learn how to adapt your driving style to get the best results. You know that if you push a particular pedal too hard, then energy starts to flow out of the engine rather than of the electric motor, and so on. So you can adjust your actions accordingly to improve the economy of the vehicle. So by materializing the invisible, we can ensure that people act more sustainably. I took a stab at how this might look for, say, This is a sort of hypothetical home hub. I think sort of like a Nest or an Echo Show, something along those lines. By materializing the data flows within the system at any one moment, an individual can see what data is being collected about them, the current status of that, where it's being transmitted, and then intervene in that system as well. So my idea is that these could all be tapped upon or withdrawn or something like that, corrected, overridden, and so on. I also think, referring back to this idea of trying to act against some of the tendencies of user-centered design that have been taught to us, we should actually increase interface friction where it's relevant to do so. This is my attempt to create a highly frictional interface where there's highly sensitive data available. So we've got theoretically de-identified information here. But of course, as we know, any data that's de-identified bears the risk of re-identification in future. I've made a typo, I think, in that. It should be re-identification. And so we have a duty, I think, to alert users when that's the case and to really pause and say, rather than don't make me think, make me think. Engage people in that conversation, make them take that decision with the gravity that it deserves. So I'm suggesting here we actually have to get them to write it in with a stylus or with a finger or something like that so they really know what they're signing away. Critique is also a particularly important moment, I think, for us to take ethical steps. The idea of a designated dissenter, this cropped up in Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher's book, Design for Real Life. This is essentially a role of antagonism, sort of constructive opposition. This person is there to lob in a grenade of defiance every now and then, mostly in critique, and say, well, maybe I don't want to do that, or maybe what if my name only has 2 characters and this field has 3? Or more seriously, what if I'm going through a divorce, or if I'm being harassed on this platform? How does this system affect my experience of the platform? How does it affect my vulnerable emotional state that results? Critique is also, I think, a particularly important point to apply those ethical tests that I talked about previously, the utilitarian test, the means not ends, all that sort of stuff, I think sits particularly well within this. Of course, testing has to come into this as well. Kate Crawford, who I'm sure many of you know very well, talks about fairness forensics, a way to test algorithms for their suitability for the real world, if you like, whether they're ready to go, whether they've been debiased as much as possible. But I'm also a big fan of getting the qualitative experience looked at here as well. Field research should take in as diverse a range of participants as it can to try and minimize the risks, because who better to act as a dissenter than someone who has genuine cause to dissent. Get people in to test the provocatypes that you've made. And then also this idea of stress testing. This is something that's maybe a little bit high risk. Again, this is something that is in that book I mentioned by Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachter-Becher. But testing people or inviting people in to look at interfaces when they've actually experienced the particular harm that you're trying to reduce or to mitigate, or even are currently undergoing it. This is something, obviously, you need to do very carefully. You need to have properly trained researchers. You might need some counsellors maybe on staff with that. But if you really want to get insight into the effects on the individuals involved, that's clearly probably the most effective way. And then zooming out a bit, I think there are things that we can do collectively as teams and as managers and leaders and so on to create what I would call ethical infrastructure. Diverse teams, of course, have ethical power. They act essentially as an early warning system, as an alert that if you might be heading down a road that actually you don't want to pursue. And I've sat in meetings and crit and so on, where I've seen people from different backgrounds say, well, you do realize that this thing we're considering doing would actually harm us or would lead us down a path that we don't want to work that way. It's not right for this community or this, this group that I know well. Career ladders and behaviours should include some kind of ethical language to make it clear that ethics is the responsibility of not just a particular anointed group, but everyone. We should know, for instance, how a senior product manager should behave compared to a PM2 or something like that. My old boss at Twitter, Mike Davidson, talks about the idea of, or how important it is to reward the right behaviors, not just the right results. If you reward just the results, you might get all sorts of behaviors that happened to have been successful. You may be setting yourself up for future ethical harm. Core values, I think, are particularly important. Any large firm, of course, has these, and they vary from the trite to the actually quite meaningful. My main bugbear is when I see core values that are too short. I see a lot of companies have, single word, innovative, as a core value, which is useless because it can be twisted by anyone to serve their own purposes. How can you object to this tracking software that I built? It's innovative, that kind of thing. Even if the core values are not ideal, though, you can create more localized variants. You can create design principles that work for individual teams or for projects. And the great thing about those is they act almost as sort of ethics in deep freeze. They act as a guiding star where you're not sure of the direction to take. Then consulting the design principles can be a really useful step forward. But of course, morality is a muscle that needs exercise. It's not something that's, it's not granted to someone the ability to do the right thing. It's something we have to work at. The good life is one that is actively chosen. So we have to ask ourselves some quite tough questions as individuals and as practitioners. We have to ask ourselves, well, how might I be screwing up right now in my work that I don't know? Maybe if we're using those ethical lenses, which one of those lenses applies the most to me or appeals the most to me? What would my ethical limit be? Where would I draw a line and say, I'm not willing to do this? And how would I respond to that? And once you've asked yourself those questions, I think it's important to ask them of others and to involve other people in those discussions, your line manager particularly, just to say, hey, well, I'm starting to think about these questions. Because, of course, once you're primed for that conversation, it makes it so much easier to have that tough conversation with others a little bit later on if required. I think it's important, if possible, if it's safe to do so, to stand up for what's right, to occasionally increase the personal risks that you take. Cass Sunstein, who's now better known as one of the architects of nudge theory, he proposed what he called a norm entrepreneur. It's kind of an ugly phrase, but essentially this is someone who's fairly visible, has some power in an organization or in a society that takes a stand and says, actually, I don't think we should be doing this anymore. The way we've chosen to do this is wrong. We need to try and change the norms of our community. Now, I recognize that's kind of a privileged position to be in. Not everyone has that safety, if you like, to put themselves in that vulnerable position. People have different needs and circumstances. But if you feel safe and comfortable and respected in your team, in your industry, then you're in a perfect position to use up a little bit of that goodwill when necessary to try and push for ethical change. And the nature of that disobedience can be, obviously it can be hard and fast, I refuse to do this. It can be gentler, however. It can be, I'm not comfortable about the direction we're taking this. Are there alternative perspectives? Are there different ways that we can look at this problem, proposing different solutions to achieve the same goals? And of course, finally, there's a need for us to collectivize our work or our efforts as well. It's very easy, I think, to see an ethical campaign as something that needs someone strong to stand up, a norm entrepreneur that I talked about. But it can't be sustained that way. A norm entrepreneur can start these things off, but you need allies, you need wider consultation if ethical change is really to happen. I'm particularly keen that we engage the public in that. There's something I call the technocracy trap here. It's very easy for us to say, well, only we speak the language of technology. Only we know what's happening inside these devices. Therefore, it's probably down to us to decide, the social impact of these things. And I think that's a big mistake. I think that will be a mistake for our field if we keep thinking that way. I also think we need to find moral allies, as I say, internally. And also not forgetting that we are consumers and voters, and we have power through those as well. We have powers to engage the public, to educate them about what's happening inside their technologies. We have powers to lobby for change at a political level, even through the ballot box. So I think there are a host of opportunities for technologists to try to push for ethical change. It's not an easy job, for sure. I mean, can tell you from my own personal experience, it doesn't necessarily make your life smoother. But I do think there's something powerful in it, that it helps you also step a little bit closer to the kind of person you want to be in the world. And I think we need now to start taking these steps to push for a more fair, inclusive and thoughtful industry. And we're going to need all the people we can get. So I'm delighted to be with you today, and I look forward to see what you all come up with in the coming years. I'm not really here to plug the book, but I have written a book about this. Should it be of interest, future-ethics.com. And thank you for your time. Okay, so I think we have some time for questions if there are any. I'm also happy just to chat one-on-one if people would rather do that at the end.
Yeah, and there are mics all around us.
There are, yeah. So mind your language.
Comforting utility. Also, I heard that the stream, ironically, there was like some Azure issues, so the stream is delayed a little bit. There are some folks that are behind, so there may be more questions you get at a later.
Sure thing. Yep.
But yeah, any questions from the room?
As you've gone through kind of talking about this, have you seen good examples of where people are taking some of these principles and applying them?
Essentially, no. I was talking with Josh about this, just before we kicked off. That hasn't really been a focus for me. I've wanted to tackle it from first principles. Probably the company that seems to have its act most together, at least from the outside, is Salesforce, which surprised me. I didn't really expect that they would be on the forefront of it, but they've gone down the whole sort of ethics committee route, which I'm skeptical of, to be honest. But they've got the right people in. They've made it cross-functional, cross-disciplinary. They've engaged with academics, real proper ethicists, things like that. And they seem to be putting together something quite interesting. They're investing behind it properly. They're getting senior support. So I'm watching their efforts. Google has a whole bunch of efforts, some quite mature, a lot not, from what I hear. They've also reached out. They've reached out to academia. Shannon Valler, who's a virtue ethicist, an extremely good one, has just joined the Google Cloud AI team on like a one-day-a-week sort of consultancy thing, which I think is excellent. DeepMind, DeepMind definitely, a long way ahead of pretty much anyone, because the harms are fairly high with some of their work, and they've been in trouble already. They misused NHS data in the UK. They got in a whole heap of trouble for that. So they're quite keen to be squeaky clean. But again, they've appointed good, respected individuals and academics and practitioners to committees there. But I haven't seen that many teams sort of internalize and operationalize it that well yet. I'm not privy to the inside of a lot of these companies yet. Hopefully that will change. Which is why I'm actually really excited about the model you have here, which seems to be bringing that stuff close to product and design, because that's the apex of where these decisions are made.
I didn't hear too much at a higher level. We're talking about product and design. We've talked through a lot of companies, but there does seem to be these two polarities when it comes to data in terms of services that are given away for free because you are the product, you're not the customer, right? Their customers are people who are targeting your eyeballs, and they could care less about ethics, right? Or that's a broad statement, right? Versus companies like Salesforce, companies like Microsoft, who are products who sell products, and with that comes a certain semblance of privacy because you're buying a product versus you being the product and taking advantage of a free service and paying for it with your data privacy. So how do you, first, does the book go deeper into that? Because if you're talking about ethics and AI, you have to acknowledge that motions around one business model are different from motions across a different business model on the other end of the spectrum, right? And putting all of these on the same playing field, they're playing two totally different games in terms of following the money and following the profit.
The book does go into more detail, a chapter on it. I'm going to disagree. I think they are fundamentally the same. I reject this idea that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product being sold. And I reject that idea, but not in the way you might expect. The way I reject it is, even if you're paying for the product, you're still the product being sold. I go to a cinema and I pay 13 quid for the ticket, I still have to sit through 25 minutes of ads. I sign up to Netflix, and they still advertise, preview their own things, and they use it to tweak their own algorithms to recommend me things that make me come back to the product more. I'm still being sold in exactly the same way. So I actually reject the separation done on business models. I think there's a potentially quite strong ethical harm that results from some of that discussion. I hear people who like to use words like surveillance capitalism, they often end up going to a place that I actually don't think is very helpful, which is to conclude essentially that the only ethical business model is one that's funded by the consumer. And I disagree, because that itself is discriminatory and inaccessible decision. That's taking the power of technology away from billions. You're then saying that technology essentially should be only the domain of the rich. So I actually don't see that fundamental distinction. Every company is incentivized to get as much data as they can on individuals. There is, however, a bifurcation in terms of privacy being used essentially as a luxury good. And there's quite a sort of theory about this, that privacy is now being sold essentially as an upmarket thing. You can, to be very crude about it, you can say Apple's strategy and Google's strategy when it comes to Android and iOS are bifurcated along those lines. You have iOS as being positioned more as a privacy first, but very much a luxury product. The selling price keeps going up. Whereas Android is far stronger on privacy than a lot of people give it credit for, but it's certainly aiming for reach. And of course, they recognize that there's an advertising model that needs to be funded by it. But again, this is, I think, a potential harm of that separation, is you start thinking that privacy is really only something that should be funded by the consumer. And as such, it becomes kind of optional if you let that split happen. So that's why I reject that premise. I don't mean to be sort of hostile to your question, but I don't think it's an accurate reflection of what's actually happening inside the industry, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I don't mean to be hostile to your I think there is a significant difference here, because if you're using Twitter as your example, which is a free service that sells eyeballs. I know that's where you come from, but if that is, no, I don't pay for Twitter, and its business model is selling my eyeballs.
And selling its data to everyone else.
And
No, that's fundamentally not true. Twitter, Facebook, etc., categorically do not sell data. If they did, they'd go bankrupt. Their data is the competitive analysis, is their competitive advantage. What they sell is access to the user on the platform. And that's a very significant difference, because they're then incentivized to treat that data with the respect that it should have.
If I have a product and I'm selling the product to somebody, the ability to capture data is an additional value for me, and that needs to be treated very ethically, right? And that's where it's complex. If my business model is marketing, and now we kind of this weaponized marketing, it is a different conversation around ethics. It would appear to be. I think this is saying that they're the same thing, and that we're just turning it into privacy or the business model. There are ethical conversations across the spectrum, but these two polarities have different sensibilities around ethics, especially because one of them deals with the true nature of marketing, which has been around for decades before the internet. But once you get to this weaponized marketing and addictive marketing, versus another one that says we're selling products that generate data, but how do we democratize this data by selling them products that they can have access to that data itself?
I recognize the stereotype. I don't view it as true. I haven't seen that pan out as a difference within industry, to be honest.
It's interesting that it speaks a little bit to the feedback loop you described of like user as the ends or the means. In the distinction, I think, to your point, Rick, about selling a piece of hardware or software,
such as Salesforce,
that has a specific use, and you measure it in a certain way, versus one that is essentially designed to keep you using it, that justifies a lot of its use by the very data that you apply to it. So there's an interesting.
There may be something that sort of bridges that sort of gap in our opinions, which is I do think there are differences in how users are treated and the ethical responsibilities that come from that, where engagement is prioritized. And a lot of Twitter and Facebook's and Instagram's increasing failings have come from chasing engagement metrics. So from that point of view, that's not an intentional decision, though. That's not that one company cares about privacy and ethics and one doesn't because the business model is the business model predicates certain default decisions, I suppose, which make it harder to challenge. So the reason I shake my head a bit when people say they're selling eyeballs and so on, there is sometimes, I'm not saying this is necessarily the case here, but there's sometimes a disingenuous argument to say that, well, Google's just an advertising company. It's not. Google is a product company doing a whole bunch of very difficult technical stuff. It's funded by advertising. But you can bet your ass that most of the people at that company don't care about the advertising. They're grateful it's there to pay their salaries, but they're there to make great technology. It's like saying that ITV was a commercial network in the UK. There's not an advertising network. They put on programs. They try to put on the best entertainment they possibly can. I like to assume positive intent. Of course, it has to be funded, and that funding may have some implications. But for me, there's quite an important distinction to be made about the intention of that company. Anyway, sorry to...
Maliciousness.
Sorry?
I wasn't attributing maliciousness.
Sure. Understood. Thanks.
So kind of back to the question about like who's doing well, it's like how do you measure your like ethical robustness in your organization, right? Because it's like aside from getting caught, it's hard to tell whether or not your organization is making ethical choices.
Yeah. I'm always a little bit wary of that particular line because you start sometimes to make business cases for ethics. You start to say, well, if we do this, we will have the following results, which will affect our OKRs or our KPIs in a particular way. When you do that, you're making ethics subservient to the profit imperative. And you lose, because the profit imperative is what's causing a lot of, pretty much all, of the ethical problems the tech industry has faced. That said, there are things that you can look at. You can obviously look at things like user retention. You can look at customer satisfaction and NPS. You can look at these kind of things. But I'm always just nervous about treading into that territory. Staff retention as well, I think, is quite a good lagging indicator, I suppose.
Oh, interesting. I guess, part of my interest is more from like, so if you prompted us to build organizations which have ethical choices, that are making ethical choices, right? And it seems like, how would I measure the success of my initiative to build an ethical organization? Yeah.
I think it has to be experiential. I think it has to be what you observe within that company. I'm skeptical about sort of abstracting it into something that's easily, put on a slide. See, that's my difficulty with it. It has to be, what's the quality of the conversation that are happening around me in the design studio or within critique sessions or demo days or internal messaging systems or whatever it is. As to how you turn that into something more tangible, I don't know, and I kind of don't want to know at this stage. You see what I mean? Again, sorry to be evasive.
No, I think that's helpful, even just saying that like this is a subjective measure.
Oh yeah.
You need it to be embedded in the culture and to say like, in a certain way, it's a risk that you can't mitigate in a lot of ways. That it's like, because the risk is that in the future I make a bad decision. It's like, well, yes, that's always a possibility.
Yeah. It's certainly places I've been. The employee satisfaction surveys. One of the questions they ask is, do you trust leadership to do the right thing? And so, there are other vehicles like that. HR BPs love to talk about that kind of stuff, right? But I don't have a more sophisticated answer for you, I'm afraid. Sorry. Thanks.
I think that's where we probably face a lot of the stuff on the product side. As we kind of look at ourselves, we kind of joke we're like the applied team, right? We take a lot of the theory and try to bring it to product teams. I think the challenge is product teams talk in KPIs, which is good in a lot of ways. And so to meet them where they're at, sometimes you have to put something like that in front of them and make this business case of why this stuff is important. And I think that's where we struggle, is how do you translate something that's a gray area and you don't want to just put it on a slide. But at the same time, you have to convince someone that it is important and aligns to them. And it's not fluffy. It's not this like nice to have feel good thing. And I think that's where it's totally experimental, to your point, kind of this experiment. But I think that as an industry is something we have to get better at, is actually how we make this thing real for folks and care. And so I don't have an answer. We're trying to figure that out now as a team. But it'd be interesting as you work through companies and especially companies like a Salesforce and these other companies you mentioned, how they're actually doing the applied stuff.
Yep.
How they're taking these company-wide policies and actually, how does the data scientist internalize that? How does the engineer that's actually building the model internalize that?
Yeah. I mean, that's not been a focus of what I've been working on. Hopefully, that will become clearer with time. It's what can I say? It's a challenge. I had something intelligent to say about it, but maybe it'll come back to me.
So early on in the talk, you said something like technology is going to ask us to put more and more of our lives into its systems. Is it really technology that's going to ask us to do that, or is technology merely a proxy for the government to ask us to do that? Because government wants to be more efficient. They see technology as a way of doing that. And if that's the case, then the ethical issues really fall back at the government level.
There are many conveniences that will be offered to the market that are purely private. Autonomous vehicles will be one, for instance. Home security locks and things like that. The governments plural will absolutely want to. Yes, how to put it? Improve efficiencies, improve all sorts of other things as well, some of which may be positive, some may not be. You're absolutely right, and I haven't really talked about that side of things. But again, it actually kind of relates to the point I was making and slightly ranting on earlier as well. I don't see that, if you like, the business model of business and the business model of government doesn't really matter. Like, they both want that. Pretty much anyone in a position to offer a service or impose a service or a product or any kind of interaction with technology will probably try to find a way to increase the trust required to expand their scope, if you see what I mean. So yes, absolutely, there need to be government responses, and we need to be part of those responses. But I kind of left that a little bit aside. Yeah, thanks.
Curious if you thought at all that one of the principles about maximizing for happiness, the zoom in that I'm curious to hear you talk about a bit more is the time window within which you measure that happiness.
Yeah, that's been one of the tricky things in utilitarian thought, from what I understand. Utilitarianism can seem weak because why would I go training for a marathon if it's just going to make me miserable, right? But in 2 years, the health gains and the achievement that I've done from actually running the damn thing, that's the payoff. So the time window is a problem, and ethicists don't give an answer to that. They say, well, you kind of, you bound it however you wish. It's one of the reasons I'm not a utilitarian. I find that all a little bit kind of sloppy. But yeah, the theory goes, you can make sacrifices in the short term to get that longer term gain. It doesn't have to be instantaneous pleasure. And some ethicists talk about different orders of pleasure, like there's the pleasure of eating an ice cream, which is fairly trivial, and there's the pleasure of having a healthy body and living a life relatively free of illness, and that should be probably a higher order of happiness, if you like. It's all still a little bit hedonistic for me, though. So again, another reason why that's not my particular lens. Yeah.
One of the ways we sometimes flip that is to think about the limitations that you impose on the potential audience or user base or market opportunity when you limit a time window to past versus future. The network effect of any emerging technology like AI is, to say we're going to productize some prediction based on past data. And there's a whole host of people who are changing their experiences, culture is evolving, there are changing and shifting demographics. And the question is, who might you be unknowingly excluding and thereby limiting your market potential?
Yeah. And also, essentially doing ethical harm. I mean, there are things like the right to be forgotten. Data has this way of freezing this kind of snapshot of the past, which denies people the opportunity to recast themselves and to throw out old beliefs that they wish to renounce. Trans people, for instance, get caught up in this quite a bit as well. Dead names committed to blockchains and things like that, irrevocable information. surely that contradicts our human capacity for forgetting, which should be, maybe a healthy part of society. So, yeah, what can I say? It's a damn hard problem. Yeah. Okay.
Cool.
Great stuff.
Thank you so much again.
Thank you, everyone. I enjoyed that. Cheers.